Let's dive into this whole gluten-free thing, huh? You've sent in a bunch of articles about gluten sensitivity, celiac disease, all that. Seems like you're ready to figure out what's real and what's hype.
Yeah, and there's a lot of hype out there. It's interesting though, right? You've got people's personal stories about going gluten-free, and then you've got the actual science of how gluten affects us.
It's a lot to unpack. We've got sources here busting myths, some getting deep into the science, all kinds of stuff. No wonder people are confused.
It's true.
Like, even the terms celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, people use them interchangeably. But these articles make it clear they're totally different things.
Absolutely. We should clear that up right away. Celiac disease, that's serious. It's an autoimmune disorder. When someone with celiac eats gluten, their immune system basically attacks their small intestine. Yeah, and that damage, it messes with how your body absorbs nutrients, which can cause a whole bunch of other problems.
So it's not just a little stomach upset.
Not at all. This is a lifelong condition. Affects about 1% of people. And every single source we've got agrees. If you have celiac disease, you've got to be strictly gluten-free for life. No way around it.
Wow. Okay, so that's celiac. But what about this non-celiac gluten sensitivity? NCGS. How's that fit in?
So with NCGS, you have people who, they get those symptoms after eating: bloating, gas, fatigue, and this is key, their small intestine isn't getting damaged the way it does with celiac.
So no immune system attack on the intestines.
Right. And that's where it gets really interesting, because we don't totally understand NCGS yet. Scientists are still trying to figure out exactly what's going on.
So there's no one answer then?
Could be multiple things at play. What triggers one person might be different for someone else. It's complex.
Makes sense, though. The more we learn about the gut, the microbiome, how our bodies deal with food, it's complicated.
It is.
Speaking of complicated, I love to bust some myths. And these articles did not disappoint. Like, this whole idea that going gluten-free is a guaranteed way to lose weight.
Yeah, that's a big one.
True or false?
Totally false. Going gluten-free isn't some magic weight loss solution. In fact, a lot of those gluten-free processed foods, they're actually higher in sugar and fat.
They make up for the gluten with other stuff. I've noticed that.
Exactly. You're not careful, you might even gain weight switching to gluten-free alternatives.
Good point. Okay, myth number 2. Everyone should be gluten-free. It's healthier for everyone. I've heard that one a lot.
Oh, yeah. Gluten is like the enemy, right?
Right. But what do the experts say?
They're very clear. Unless you have celiac disease or some other diagnosed gluten-related issue, there's just no proof that going gluten-free will make you healthier. No magic.
Okay, so it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Which makes sense. It seems like this whole gluten-free trend has taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, it's definitely become a trend.
And it's important to remember that it's not always necessary.
Exactly. That's why getting a proper diagnosis is so important. If you're having issues, don't just decide you're gluten sensitive because you read something online. See a doctor.
Right. Don't self-diagnose.
Please don't. It's not a good idea for a few reasons.
Like what? What could happen?
For one thing, it can actually make it harder to get diagnosed later on. Say you think you might have celiac, right? And you stop eating gluten before getting tested.
Oh, okay.
That can mess up the results. The tests are looking for specific antibodies. And those antibodies, they only show up if you have celiac and you're actively eating gluten.
So you need to be eating gluten for the test to work.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And I guess if you just cut out gluten on your own without talking to a doctor or a dietitian,
could be a problem.
You might miss out on important nutrients, right?
Exactly. Gluten-containing grains, they can be good sources of fiber, iron, B vitamins. Several of these articles talk about that, especially the one from Baster.
Right, right.
Gluten-free doesn't automatically mean healthy. You got to be smart about it.
Yeah.
We could end up with these nutritional gaps if you're not careful.
Okay, so diagnosis is key. What about those manufactured in a facility warnings you see on labels? Like, how do you know if something's actually safe or not, especially if you have celiac?
Yeah, good question. Gluten-free labeling can be confusing. So those warnings, usually they'll say something like, manufactured in a facility that also processes wheat.
Right, right. So what does that even mean?
It doesn't necessarily mean the product is unsafe if you have celiac.
Okay.
It's more like there's a chance of cross-contamination. Like maybe they make something with wheat on the same equipment. It's a heads up, basically.
So we're talking about like trace amounts of gluten.
Yeah, exactly. And to be labeled gluten-free in the U.S., a product has to have less than 20 parts per million of gluten, FDA rule.
20 parts per million. That's tiny.
It is tiny, and a lot of manufacturers are testing even lower these days. But yeah, 20 ppm, that's the standard. But here's the thing. Remember how we were talking about misleading marketing?
Mm-hmm.
Those may contain statements, totally voluntary. A company doesn't have to put them on the label. So just because something doesn't have that warning doesn't mean it's safer.
Wow. Okay. So you really got to do your research. It's like being a detective.
Kind of, yeah.
Speaking of detective work, one of these sources, the Health Sciences Academy one, it mentioned FODMAPs. And that got me curious. It's like there's this whole other layer to this.
There is. And it's fascinating because FODMAS could be the answer for some people who have those gluten-like symptoms but don't have celiac.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so back up. What are FODMAPs again?
So there are these types of carbs that some people have a hard time digesting. We're talking like onions, garlic, some fruits, certain dairy products. And here's the connection, Wheat.
So some of these high FODMAP foods, they either contain gluten or they're usually found in foods that also have gluten.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which makes things tricky, right? Because someone might be reacting to the FODMAPs, not the gluten itself.
Wow. So how do you figure that out?
That's where working with a doctor or dietitian is so important. They can help you figure out your triggers. Maybe it's an elimination diet. Maybe it's testing.
Okay.
It's really about personalized nutrition. What works for one person might not work for another. There's no one-size-fits-all here.
That's true. All right, something else that stood out to me, the Beyond Celiac article mentioned misdiagnosis in families. What's that about?
Yeah, so celiac disease, it can look really different from person to person. Oh, yeah. Even within the same family, one sibling might have the classic digestive stuff, but another sibling, maybe they're just tired all the time, joint pain, or even no symptoms at all.
Wait, seriously? You can have celiac disease and not even know it?
It happens, and that's why family history is so important. If you have a close relative with celiac, definitely talk to your doctor about getting tested, even if you feel fine.
Because early diagnosis is key.
Absolutely. Makes a huge difference.
So much of this comes back to, knowledge is power. We've covered so much today. Celiac disease, NCGS, how they're different, busted some gluten-free myths, even talked about FODMAPs.
And we talked about diagnosis, labeling, advocating for yourself.
Right. All important stuff. It all comes down to being informed, right?
Right.
Like you were saying, you got to know the science, you got to see through the hype, and you got to advocate for yourself.
100%. And it's important to remember that this whole area of research, gluten sensitivity, NCGS, even celiac disease, it's constantly evolving. Scientists are learning new stuff all the time.
So what we know today could be different tomorrow.
Exactly. Stay curious. That's what makes this so interesting.
That's the truth. That's what I love about these deep dives. Okay, so for everyone listening, here's something to think about as you go about your day. We've talked about a lot today. So how can you use all this information to be a more informed consumer? How can you advocate for yourself or for others when it comes to gluten and making good choices about what you eat? Just a little food for thought. No gluten required.